We call it healthcare, we call it reproductive justice,
Right.
we call it termination, abortion, whatever. But at the end of the day, it is child sacrifice. The same thing we see in the Old Testament. And we think, oh, that's so terrible. We can't believe people were doing that to their children. But that's exactly what we're doing today.
Welcome to the EDIFY podcast, where our guests share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Our guest on the EDIFY podcast today is Abby Johnson, who has always been fiercely determined to help women in need. This is what led her to a career initially with Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest abortion provider, but subsequently she fled the organization and now she has become an outspoken advocate for the pro-life movement. Abby, welcome to the EDIFY podcast.
Thank you.
Such a
Thanks
pleasure
for
to
having
see
me.
you. So a few years ago, you released a movie called Unplanned, which really did quite well at the box office.
It did.
I mean, for a pro-life and an absolutely unabashedly pro-life film, was a pretty big hit. So now you have a new project, a documentary called Unthinkable, and that documents the story of former abortion clinic employees. And what I love about it is that it shows the power of God and how His love and His mercy always triumph. How did you decide to produce something like this?
Yeah, it was interesting. So my book Unplanned came out in 2011. And then a few years later, I wrote a book called The Walls Are Talking. And that came about after sitting around at a healing retreat. So in my ministry, and then there were none, we have these healing retreats with former abortion workers.
And so that's everything from abortion providers themselves
Yes,
down to the receptionist.
abortion doctors to people who answer the phones.
Right.
People who take the money,
Right.
right? So it could be anybody involved in the industry.
Okay.
So even people who do fundraising for Planned Parenthood or the abortion, anybody who's involved in abortion. So we're sitting around at this healing retreat and we're kind of telling these stories. And one of the women there said, we should put these stories in a book. And I said, you know what, we should. So that's what we did. And after Unplanned came out as a theatrical release, somebody came to me and said, have you ever thought about doing a documentary about some of the stories that are in The Walls Are Talking? And because it was kind of a shock to me how well Unplanned did in the box office. I thought, okay, well, my parents and my staff are going to go see this movie. Really, is America going to be interested in an abortion film?
Mm-hmm.
And to my surprise, it was number 4 in the box office on only a quarter of the screens.
Yeah. Well, I think conversion stories resonate with people.
They do.
And yours in particular, because it was so dramatic. You went from working for the largest abortion provider in the country, being given the Employee of the Year award,
Mm-hmm.
to completely changing course.
Right.
And now working on behalf of the pro-life movement. Very few people
People are like,
have a pendulum that swings that wide, right?
How
And
does
so-
that happen?
Yeah.
Right. And so we were like, maybe we could do that. So I had watched many years ago when it came out, a documentary called Hush. And it was done so well. And I just loved it. And so a long time ago, I had met the producer and director of that documentary named Drew Martin. And I had told him a long time ago, one day I wanted to do a documentary together. And so when this came to mind, maybe putting these stories, turning these stories, really taking them to life, I reached out to him and I said, I'm not a documentarian, you are. What do you think about this? And he said, I am all in. I'm ready to do it. These stories do need to come to life.
Right.
People do need to hear these. And they do need to hear about, how is it that, number one, your conscience becomes so seared that you can watch a baby be born alive and do nothing. How does that happen?
Right.
Right? How do you watch that happen and do nothing? And that not be the moment that you leave? Right?
So you mean, and in a day's work at a clinic, you would occasionally have babies that were actually born alive who
Not
survived.
me,
Right.
but some of these workers.
Some do, right.
Who have gone through our ministry, right? And that, that wasn't the moment that they said, I'm out of here.
Well, your EDIFY video, you reference how lucrative the work is in the abortion industry. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those salaries might look like, to the average person who wouldn't be aware of them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge deciding factor for a lot of these women.
Both in going to work there.
And
not
staying.
Leaving. Right.
Okay, so it's a hook. It's a trap. So it's a money trap. So a lot of these women, just like the pro-life movement, does a really good job of exposing the eugenic nature, the racist roots of the abortion industry, right? What I think they didn't realize, what the pro-life movement didn't realize, and we talk a lot about this as abortion workers, former abortion workers, is that same principle applies to the staff. It applies to how they recruit staff. So they go into low-income neighborhoods, they go into community colleges, they go into places where there's a lot of single moms with low SES, low education levels, and they say, hey, you actually don't need to finish this degree, right? You don't need to have any sort of higher education. You just come work for us. It doesn't even matter if you have a high school diploma. You come straight to work for us, and we're going to start you out paying, I don't know, $18, $20 an hour. Now, for a woman who doesn't have a high school education, or she just has a high school education, and she's a single mom, and they're paying all of her benefits, they're paying all of her insurance for her children, for herself, this is huge. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money.
That's a step up in terms
They're giving her, paid time off. They're super flexible with her schedule. This seems like a dream come true. So they get her hooked into this lifestyle, and they say, you know what, and you're only going to be answering the phones. Easy, right? Because she may go in and say, I really don't like abortion. I'm really not comfortable with abortion. They say, don't worry about it. You're only going to be answering the phone. You don't ever have to participate in abortion. And she says, okay, I'll do it. $18, $20 answering the phone. How easy is that? Right? Anybody can do that. They get her in. They get her hooked on the lifestyle. She starts living in an apartment that she could not afford unless she's making $18 to $20 an hour. She goes out, she gets herself a car that she could not afford unless she's making $18 to $20 an hour. Then they start moving her back, and now she's working with patients. They give her a $2 an hour raise. Now she's making $22 an hour, right? So she goes further along into that lifestyle. Well, now she's more comfortable. Now all of a sudden they need her to work in the procedure room. Well, she's not really comfortable with that. But they require it. She has to do it. This is now part of her job. And she can't leave. Because if she leaves, how's she going to pay her rent? Mm-hmm. How's she going to pay for her car? Her children now are reliant on this insurance, on this health care. It's a hook. It's a trap for her.
It's like that old adage of the frog in the water, right?
Yes.
You just turn the water temperature up slightly.
That's right.
And the frog won't jump out.
We've had women who have contacted us. And, they've said, I want to leave. I know what I'm doing is evil. I know we're killing babies. I know that my soul is in jeopardy. I know that if I died today, I would go to hell. I mean, that's what they've told us.
Really? And are these women Catholic primarily, or were they Catholic, Christian, every other faith you can imagine?
All other kinds of, all kinds of Christian faiths. But they say, but my child has special needs. And this is the first time my child has ever been able to get the health care that they need. And so they say, I'm willing to put my soul at risk so that I can stay here and my child gets the health care that they need.
Right.
I've never been able to find the right word for that. But there's something to it that's very striking to me.
Well, it's blackmail to a certain extent.
Well, it is.
I mean, not in a direct way, but if the moral culpability for someone, it's the first choice that's the problem, right? It's the first time you say, "Okay, I'm just answering the phones," and you go in.
Yeah.
And again, we don't know what a person's background is, and God will judge those people according to how He knows their hearts. But it seems to me that once you're in, then it, like you say, it's gradual at first, but then almost impossible not to do what you're doing. I mean, you see that in all kinds of different contexts, right?
Yeah, of
in
course.
war and in other human rights atrocities and that sort of thing.
Right.
I do have a friend who had 3 different abortions, and I remember her telling me the first one was hard. She said the other 2 were easy.
Of course.
She said, the first one I cried and I couldn't sleep at night. After that, she said, I didn't bother me. It was no more different than going to get a tooth pulled at the dentist. I really did, because her conscience had been deadened.
Sin becomes easier.
Right.
The more you sin, that particular sin gets easier and easier and easier to commit. Yeah. Because your conscience has become seared. And that happens. But I think, our goal is to remove that fear from these women and men. We do have a few men that come through our ministry, but our goal is to remove that fear and to also protect their soul, right?
Oh, of course.
So that when a woman does come to us and say, I know this is evil, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I want to protect my child, I want my child to be able to get health care, we can say, okay, leave today. We will continue to pay for your child's health care until you get another job, right? Because we don't ever want money to be the reason that prevents someone from leaving an evil place that they're work. It's money, right?
So that's the price. So if there's one factor running through all of the men and women that you assist in your ministry, and then there were none, money would be the one linking factor among all of them?
I would say money is a reason that keeps a lot of them there, yes. Okay. But I will say this. For the doctors, it's something very different.
Okay, I mean, talk about that, because, I remember when I first started in the pro-life movement, 25 years ago, and a couple of doctors had come forward, and Bernard Nathanson was one, and Tony Levatino was another. But, some doctors would talk about some of their classmates in medical school, and you did not need to be an OBGYN to go and do abortions. I mean, optometrists could go and do them, And so they could make, sometimes upwards of $2,000 a day. I mean, back in the early 80s, that was a lot of money. They paid off all their medical school loans. They got rid of them. They would do it for a year or two, and then they would leave. But they did it because they could make so much cash under the table so quickly. That's what, and they were in significant amounts of debt from medical school. Yeah. But talk about the doctors a little bit, because that's the only perspective I've heard all this time. What motivates some of them?
And that happens. So you've got some medical students. They come out of school and they've got this enormous amount of debt. They do abortions for a couple years. They leave, and that's kind of behind them. But I'm more talking about, and those really aren't the doctors that come through our ministry. We would love to see them if they get to a point where they're like, I can't believe I did that, and now I have all of this, I need to repent, and we would of course see them, right? But those aren't the ones that are coming through our ministry. The ones that are coming through our ministry are the ones that have done a lot of abortions. They have done abortions for decades, and now they're coming to a place where they're like, what have I done?
Really?
I need to leave. Always because of some sort of spiritual moment.
Like a St. Paul life. Getting knocked off the horse kind of moment. Okay.
Yes. And so, you look at a lot of the abortionists that are still currently practicing in the United States, and a lot of them are elderly. They're in their late 80s, mid to late 80s. Warren Hearn, Curtis Boyd, Leroy Carhart. These are elderly men. They're still performing abortions. And you think, why? They paid for their houses in cash when they were in their 50s. Okay. They don't need the money. Right. It's not about money for them. And I think that's where a lot of people in the pro-life movement have it wrong when it comes to the doctors. They think the doctors are all doing it for money. It's not about money. Not for the majority of these doctors who've been doing it for a long time. They are abortionists. That's what they do. Right?
It's a whole identity.
It's it's more than that. They like holding life and death in their hands. They like playing God. It's a bloodlust for them. It's so much deeper than what we understand, because abortion is a spiritual battle, right? The money part of it, that's like a physical thing, right? And abortion's not a physical battle.
Right.
Abortion is a spiritual battle.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of Kermit Gosnell, who, of course, is the doctor who, performed thousands of abortions, and you would snip the necks of babies after they were born alive, et cetera, et cetera. But when you talk about that bloodlust, that's what comes to mind. And I read the documentary that two Irish journalists who went and they sat for every day in the trial, and they could not understand why there were not American journalists packing that room. I mean, one of them told me personally, if this had happened in Ireland, this would have been on the news every single night for 2 weeks. Like, no one would have missed this trial because it was so horrific. And I remember even the New York Times having to admit that the judge ordered psychological assistance to every one of the jurors because what they had seen and heard. But there were, and I'm sorry, this is so graphic and it's so hard to say, that he was feeding the remains of some of the unborn children to his turtles. Like, this is how depraved this man became, and sat there and smiled through his entire trial. I mean, it's almost like a Criminal Minds episode or something in some ways.
Well, he still does.
Yeah. Well, he's in prison now, but.
Well, I mean, but to this day, if you went to interview him
I
right
see what you
now,
mean. Yeah.
if you went to interview him right now, he's happy, he's jolly, he smiles, and he says that one day he believes that medicine will come to appreciate what he has done. He has no remorse. He believes that he's done a good thing for medicine. Now, we have someone who's part of our ministry who worked for him for years.
Really?
She actually spent 28 months in a Pennsylvania prison system because of her work with him. She is part of our ministry now. She speaks publicly. But she says, this woman, Adrienne, who's part of our ministry, I mean, she's like, he was wealthy for decades. Yeah. It wasn't about the money.
No.
Right? Abortion is child sacrifice. And that's at its core what abortion is. It's what it always has been. We don't call it that because we want to call it something much more palatable.
Healthcare.
We call it healthcare. We call it reproductive justice. We call it termination, abortion, whatever. But at the end of the day, it is child sacrifice. The same thing we see in the Old Testament, right? We talk about Baal and Molech and all of these things, right? And we think, oh, that's so terrible. We can't believe people were doing that to their children. But that's exactly what we're doing today. And so that really is at the heart of what's taking place inside of the soul of these doctors and some of the more higher ups, I would say, in the abortion industry. I mean, my boss was very depraved, and she would joke around about, the body parts of babies and all these types of things. That does happen in the abortion industry. My boss, raised Catholic school, her whole life. And, but I will tell you this is really interesting. I think people listening will find this interesting. One day we had a Franciscan sister come out to our facility to pray. First time she'd ever come out. Okay. And actually the first time I'd ever seen a nun.
Really?
In real life.
Because you were raised a Protestant.
And I'd never seen a nun in real life. And I was like, oh my gosh, they really still exist. I mean, that was so weird to me,
That's
It was so weird.
Outside of the sound of music.
Right,
you didn't know, right?
And so I was like, oh my gosh, like, is this real? Is this like a real nun? And she's out there. It was burning up hot. It was Texas summer. She's out there and full habit. And I'm just staring at her, and her face is so red because it's so hot. She's out there. And so I was kind of fascinated by it. But then I walk off. I start, I'm doing my day, doing whatever I need to do in the clinic that day. And I walk back into my office, and there's my boss. And she's standing there at the window, staring at her. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess she's looking at her too. I walk away. I come back 30 minutes later. She's still standing there, staring at her. I leave. I come back. Like an hour later, she's still standing there, staring at her. And she was so bothered, but also in a way moved just by seeing this religious sister standing out in front of our facility praying. And I remember that day, I've written about it in one of my books. One of the cars, it was an abortion day. One of the cars drove out, a woman had had her abortion. I remember this sister who I now know, she just fell to her knees weeping.
It's a visual reprimand.
Yeah.
And
my boss was just very, not angry, but just very bothered by it. Almost like it reminded her of her childhood.
Yeah.
It broke something in her. And so that's why I'm always telling priests and religious how powerful their presence is on the sidewalk. Because I worked with several Catholics and several fallen away Catholics. And their presence is very, very powerful for the people inside of the facility. Not just the people driving in. It's also very powerful for the people driving in. Because we would have people call and say, when is the priest leaving? I don't want to come in until the priest is gone.
Yeah, you know who used to say that all the time was Monsignor Philip Riley, who founded the
Yes.
Helpers of God, the Helpers of God's Precious Infants. And he had a very large image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that always went to the abortion clinics with him. And of course, that's the only apparition of Our Lady where she is expecting. And when Hispanic people would come up to the clinic doors, generally, Chicago has a lot of Mexicans, and where I live, and they wouldn't walk past the image. It was very interesting, and they couldn't. Or if they did, they'd put something up to shield their faces so they didn't have to look at Our Lady, almost as if she was gazing at them. So the presence of the religious in their habit, that their habit is itself a symbol of not only God's just anger, but also of God's mercy and love. And that's so interesting that
and also their
you
sacrifice.
had that experience. Yes,
It's their sacrifice as well, right? That habit, it's a sacrifice. And when you go to have an abortion, you are saying, I'm not willing to sacrifice. And it does something inside of them. We would always have calls. Every time a priest was out, every time a religious sister was out, we would always have those phone
clients, potential clients rather, calling you from outside saying, I don't want to come in.
I don't want to come in.
I don't want to walk past.
Do you know when the sister's going to leave?
Yeah.
Do you know when the nun's going to leave? Do you know when the priest is going to leave? I can't come in as long as they're there.
Really
so it is very powerful. So I'm always encouraging, our religious sisters and our priests to go out there. They make it's like an outward sign of our inward conscience.
Right.
Particularly as Catholics. And even as non-Catholics.
Right.
Oh,
no.
The collar means something.
Oh, sure.
To everyone.
And they know what it means.
Even non-Catholics.
Right? No, they know what it means, and they understand the force for good that women religious and priests are in the world, right? And so I do think that there's something that's very, very interesting that you should pick up on that, and it's very interesting that even non-Catholics inside your abortion clinic could pick up on it as well.
Well, my boss, who was this very, public, I'm a proud atheist. Right. She could not take her gaze.
That's interesting.
Off of that sister standing there.
The Sisters of Life in New York, they take a private fourth vow to always uphold the dignity and sanctity of life. And they often accompany mostly women of color, but poor women to their OB appointments so that they won't be pressured to have abortions. And one woman I know who would occasionally also accompany them said the difference, the way those doctors treated them, if they walked in with one of the sisters, was just mind-blowing. Like all of a sudden they were spoken to with respect. They were not pressured to have their tubes tied after they delivered their babies. They were treated like children, like daughters of God, as they should have been treated, even without anyone there. But it was remarkable what the presence of one of those sisters would do. And not just to the doctor, but to the nurse who was there, to the rest of the staff that would be, in whatever the maternity clinic happened to be. Very interesting. Yeah.
And it's sad because everyone should be treated with that kind of dignity, that sort of dignity, no matter who's in the room.
Yeah, sisters shouldn't have to go with you in order for you to be treated like a like a human being,
Yes.
right? Tell me about some of the fruits that you've seen from this documentary so far.
Yeah, it's been really beautiful actually, because just even the people that we've interviewed that are not former clinic workers. So we've interviewed, kind of a wide array of people. We've interviewed researchers that have researched, abortion regret and things like that. We've interviewed other OBGYNs that have never been, practicing abortion doctors.
Right.
And, just different people,
Right.
And what's been interesting is that a lot of them, after walking away, we've talked to them about what we've heard and what we found. And it's been really beautiful because they've looked at us and just said, they've looked at me and they've said, hey, I'm so glad you're doing this because I honestly have just never thought about the abortion workers. Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad you're doing this and you're telling people about this side of the pro-life movement.
Right.
I'm glad that you're talking about this because I've never prayed for them.
Yeah.
I've never thought of them. I've never thought to reach out to them.
Mm-hmm.
They are a forgotten piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And, it is an important piece of the puzzle that I think people do forget, because I think a lot of people do dehumanize the workers in the clinic because we look for someone to blame.
Right.
Anytime there's human tragedy, that's very natural.
Right.
Anytime there's a human tragedy, and abortion is, I believe, the greatest human tragedy of our time, we look for somebody to blame. Sure. We need to blame someone. And I think instead of blaming the industry as a whole, right, as this big systemic monster, right, we look to the individuals and we say, you're bad, mm-hmm. you're evil, you're terrible, I don't like you.
Right. There's a lot of transference.
Yes.
From, right.
And so, this gives people a way to say, you know what, they have a tragic story as well.
Right.
70% of the abortion workers that work in the industry have had abortions as well.
That is very interesting. I did not know that statistic.
So many of them are lured in.
So it's a justification.
Because of their own abortion.
Right.
Right? I'm on this sinking ship. I'm going to drag as many people
down with me as I can. Yeah.
And so it's been really interesting. Also, another fruit of this has just been really the courage that I have seen come out of those workers that have been involved. It's hard to share your greatest sin publicly.
Sure.
If I walked up to someone on the street and I put a microphone and camera in their face and I said, "Tell me the worst thing you've ever done."
And then nobody wants to be known from then till the day they die for the worst thing that they ever did in their lives. Right.
I mean, most people don't want to tell you.
Yes.
Most people are going to be like, "No thanks. I don't want the world to know."
Right.
Right. Most people don't want to share that. They want to keep it private. But these women are willing to do that. They're willing to say, "Yes, I will share it." And I know this is going to go on a screen, mm-hmm. potentially for millions of people to see it. I'm willing to do it anyway, because that's how much I believe in ending abortion. That's how much I believe in righting my wrong.
Right.
And some of them have, they've never shared the things that they're sharing in this documentary publicly. They're doing it. And that is so courageous to me. Yeah. And they have received a lot of healing from that. And so that's been very fruitful.
Well, that's, I mentioned the woman I know who had 3 abortions, and I met her because she was doing pro-life talks. And her parents found out about her 3 abortions when she gave her testimony for the first time. She said, the person I did not want to know the most was my father. I did not want my dad to know that I did that. That was the hardest person for her to tell. She said, complete strangers? That was fine. Sure. But I didn't want my dad to know that. And her mom as well, but it was her dad that she felt she hurt the most. Well, so listeners, we're going to have a link where you can watch Abby's documentary, Unthinkable. It'll be down on the show notes. So Abby, is there one thing, or maybe there's more than one thing, but if you had to narrow it down to one thing, what's the most important thing that people take away after watching Unthinkable?
Abortion is the greatest human tragedy of our time that we have ever seen in our lifetime. The only way that we will win this culture battle is by having individual dialogue, by sharing our stories, that our stories do matter.
Mm-hmm.
They matter more than people understand, more than people realize. And that while laws are so important, because laws are a teacher, that dialogue is what is actually going to change our culture. Those one-on-one talks, sharing our stories, that is what is going to change our culture from one of death to life and truly make abortion unthinkable. And that is our goal.
No, I know that after Unplanned, the movie that was about your own experience leaving Planned Parenthood filed suit against you and dragged you into court. It's a very powerful scene in the movie. Has there been any reaction from the abortion industry, either legally or otherwise, about your new documentary?
Not so far. I almost wish there would be. That would be great PR.
Be careful for what you wish for, Abby.
That would be great
Yeah.
PR. But no, we work very closely with Thomas More Society. They are just the best of the best. And we have walked with them every step of the way on this project. And they also are great at walking with the former abortion workers as they leave the industry. Sometimes they need representation,
Right.
and they are always right there to support our workers.
For our listeners who might not know, the Thomas More Society is a public interest law firm named for St. Thomas More, who's the patron saint of lawyers and judges. And they provide free pro bono legal services to people, religious liberty cases, but also people involved in unjust actions against pro-lifers. So, well, speaking of unjust actions against pro-lifers, Catholic Vote has been tracking attacks on Catholic churches, but also on pregnancy resource centers. And we've had more than 100 of those since the leak of Dobbs back in May of 22. What are your thoughts on those two types of attacks specifically? Because it's odd that you're seeing them so directed against two specific entities, pregnancy centers and Catholic churches. You have any reflections on that?
Yeah, the pregnancy center thing is interesting because you've got this whole movement of people saying, you guys are only pro-birth, you guys don't do anything for, women and children after the child is born. And, we're like, no, but we do. We've got 3,000 pregnancy centers here to help, and we want to be here to help. And they're like, oh, really? Where are they? Because we want to vandalize them and do terrible things to them, right? It's like, wait a minute. I thought you said we're supposed to help them. We're helping them. Now you want to blow up the clinic, right? I mean, it's just...
Well, there was one clinic that was firebombed.
Yes.
Yeah. Why giving somebody a bag of diapers would make someone so...
Why are they so threatened?
Well, it's rage, too.
Yes. Why are they so threatened by us doing the thing that they say they want us to do?
Right.
Right? It's so double-minded. But that's what it is. It's confusion.
Yeah.
And that's what the enemy breeds,
Right.
is confusion. So in that way, it makes sense. Attacks on the Catholic Church, in a way, and this is, I guess, kind of backwards, but in a way, it almost makes me feel victorious because it makes me think, wow, we are really a threat.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church is really, really a threat to the demons that are here on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
right? We must really be doing something right if we are the church that is being targeted, so fiercely targeted.
Right.
And just the fact that the Catholic Church is so closely tied to the pro-life issue also gives me great hope. I hate that our churches are being targeted like that. I hate that there is vandalism against the church. I hate that they're having to, build back structures and all of this. But I think, we've done a good job at partnering ourselves as a church with the pro-life effort,
Mm-hmm.
with that message. We've done something well. there. And I want us to continue doing that, that the public knows that the Catholic Church is unabashedly pro-life.
And I just think the presence of our Lord in every Catholic church, right, in the tabernacle in every Catholic church. It's been interesting to read about the vandalism of some of the Catholic churches when these, protesters or whatever they want to call themselves, these pro-abortion protesters have managed to get in. There's, I know there was one church in Maryland where the Stations of the Cross were smashed, and the particular liturgical books that the priest uses when he's saying Mass were shredded. But they also managed to get the Blessed Sacrament out of the tabernacle and desecrate it. That it just, there's just such a demon there that you can almost palpably feel when you're reading about the descriptions alone. And when parishioners turned around the next morning and they still showed up at Mass, it was kind of like the Dr. Seuss, when the Grinch stole Christmas, when all the Who's still come down, the Whovilles were still there. Right. They all came for Mass, and it was in the gym, and they said, we're going to pray for the people who did this. It was a remarkable moment. So Abby, if you could mobilize all the pro-lifers in the United States to do one thing, what would you mobilize them to do?
I would mobilize them at this time to get involved with organizations that are helping women in need. And I mean women who are, yes, pregnant and considering abortion, but also women who are single moms and in need of help. Women who are pregnant but are not abortion vulnerable, but are still maybe struggling to pay their rent. Maybe women who are, housing unstable but need our assistance. There are so many ways that we can help moms and children in our communities. And I started an organization almost 4 years ago now called Loveline. And I started it because pregnancy centers do amazing work. And they do amazing work to help women who are in crisis, who are pregnant, who are considering abortion, who are abortion vulnerable. We wanted to help them however we can, but we also wanted to fill in the gap for women who, maybe they've already had their child. Maybe their child is 3 years old. Maybe they've got 4 children, right? And they really don't fit into the services of pregnancy centers anymore. But they still need assistance. They still need help. They chose life, right? They still have a need now. And so how do we help them? How do we help them as pro-lifers? And that's really why we started that. Or maybe they're out of proximity of a pregnancy center and they still need assistance. Maybe they're pregnant and they're not considering abortion, but you know what? I believe that most women are one crisis away from being abortion vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So how do we help that woman? How do we provide case management for these women so that they're not living a life from one crisis to another? Yeah. And I think that that's really where we as pro-lifers need to plug ourselves in. Walking with women, not just providing the diapers and saying, okay, I've done my job, right? But how can we journey with her? Right. How can we really partner with her in life? And it's messy, right? But being pro-life is messy.
Well, it's what John Paul II called radical solidarity with the woman. It is not right to leave her alone. I've always, I have that emblazoned in my brain from crossing the threshold of hope. But so just one final lightning round question. You're a convert to Catholicism?
I am.
Do you have a favorite saint?
Oh, yeah, St. Mary Magdalene.
Very good.
She's my confirmation saint.
Is she? And just a quick explanation of why. I think I have the sense, but...
she was forgiven much. She loved Jesus so much. And she was given the responsibility because of the forgiveness she received to really be an apostle and to declare how much she had been forgiven. And I feel like I have that same responsibility.
Well, Abby Johnson, former Planned Parenthood clinic director and founder of And Then There Were None. Thank you for being on the EDIFY podcast. What a pleasure to have you. And listeners, please do go out and check out her new documentary, Unthinkable. You can find a link in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.